The question of how medieval people slept is simple, but the answer is complicated. When we think of a bed, we think of a private space. It's our own little island for sleeping. It's in a bedroom, a room just for that purpose, and that room has a door that closes. For most people in the Middle Ages, this entire concept would have seemed strange. It would have been a luxury beyond imagination. To understand how they slept, you first have to understand how they lived. Let's start with the vast majority of the population. We're talking about peasants, serfs, and simple farmers. These people made up maybe 90% of everyone living in Europe at the time. Their world was small. And their homes were even smaller. The typical peasant family lived in a one-room house. That was it. One room for everything. This house, often called a cottage or a hovel, was not built to last. It was made from whatever was available locally. The walls were often wattle and daub. That means a wooden frame of woven sticks, packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof was thatch. The floor was just packed earth. Sometimes it might be covered with straw or rushes for a little warmth and to soak up spills. Inside this one room, life happened. All of it. You cooked in here over an open fire in the center of the floor. The smoke filled the room before finding its way out through a small hole in the roof. You ate in here, probably sitting on a simple bench or stool. You worked in here, mending tools or spinning wool. And you slept in here. There was no separate bedroom. There was no concept of a room just for sleeping. The very idea of privacy, as we know it, didn't really exist. Your life was a public affair within your own family. Everyone was always together. So, where was the bed? Most families didn't have one. A bed, as in a wooden frame with a mattress, was a piece of furniture, and furniture was expensive. It was a sign of wealth. A peasant family's most valuable possession was likely a cooking pot. A bed was out of the question. Instead, people slept on the floor. At night, the family would gather around the hearth. The fire was the only source of heat and light. As it died down to embers, people would find a place to lie down. They would sleep on a pile of straw or bracken. This was called a pallet. If they were a bit better off, they might have a shallow wooden box or frame to hold the straw in place. They might also have a mattress of sorts. This would be a large cloth sack, a tick, stuffed with whatever was soft. For most, that meant straw or dried leaves. This would be lumpy and would need to be restuffed often because it would get damp and full of vermin. A wealthier farmer might have a mattress stuffed with wool. A truly luxurious one would be stuffed with feathers, but that was rare for common folk. And who slept on this pile of straw? Everyone. The entire family would sleep together in one big heap. The father, the mother, all the children, and maybe a grandparent or an unmarried uncle. There was no master bed for the parents and separate beds for the kids. Everyone piled in together. They would share a single covering. This might be a rough woolen blanket, an old cloak, or animal hides. There are very good reasons for this. The first and most important reason was warmth. These houses were incredibly drafty and cold. There was no insulation. The fire gave off some heat, but it couldn't warm the whole space, especially on a winter night. The most reliable source of heat was other people. Huddling together was a simple and effective survival strategy. It trapped body heat and kept everyone from freezing. The second reason was space. There simply wasn't any other place to sleep. The single room had to serve every purpose. You couldn't dedicate a corner to each person. It was more efficient to have one communal sleeping area that could be cleared away during the day. The third reason was security. Life could be dangerous. Having the whole family together in one place meant you could hear if someone was in trouble or if a threat appeared. It created a sense of safety in a world that often felt unsafe. Sometimes the family wasn't the only group sleeping in the room. It was common for peasants to bring their most valuable livestock inside at night, especially during the winter. A cow, a few sheep, or some chickens might share the space. This was done to protect them from thieves and predators and also for their warmth. The body heat from a cow in a small hut was a significant source of extra heat, so you might be sleeping next to your children on one side and a sheep on the other. This way of sleeping all together in a single room was the absolute norm for centuries. It wasn't seen as strange or improper, it was just life. The lines we draw between public and private, between family members, and even between humans and animals were much blurrier then. The idea of sleeping alone in a separate bed in a separate room would have seemed cold, lonely, and perhaps even a little bit frightening. For the medieval peasant, sleep was a shared communal experience born out of necessity, warmth, and the simple reality of their one-room world. If you climb the social ladder away from the peasant's hut, you find more rooms and more furniture. But you don't necessarily find more privacy. In the world of the nobility, in the castles and great manor houses, the bed was not just a place to sleep. It was the most important piece of furniture in the house. It was a status symbol, a center of power, and a very public stage. The rich did not sleep on a pile of straw, they slept in what we now call a great bed. These were huge, elaborate structures. A great bed had a massive wooden frame, often intricately carved from oak. It was a four-poster bed, but not like the decorative ones we see today. The posts were thick, supporting a heavy wooden canopy or tester overhead. This canopy wasn't just for show, it served a purpose, helping to stop dirt or drafts from the ceiling falling onto the sleepers. From this canopy hung thick, heavy curtains. These curtains were often made of expensive materials like wool, velvet, or even silk, and they were frequently embroidered or lined with fur. When drawn, these curtains created a small, private, and warm room within a room. This was crucial in a large, drafty castle chamber where a single fireplace could never heat the whole space. Inside this curtained space was the mattress, or rather, mattresses. A noble bed was a layered system. The base might be a web of rope or leather straps stretched across the frame. On top of that sat a thick mattress stuffed with straw or wool. And on top of that was the feather bed. This was the ultimate luxury, a deep mattress filled with goose or swan feathers. It was soft, warm, and incredibly expensive. The bedding was also of high quality, with fine linen sheets and woolen blankets, sometimes covered with a fur throw. This bed was a massive investment. A fully furnished great bed could cost as much as a small farm. It was often the most valuable item listed in a nobleman's will. It was a clear and public declaration of wealth and status. The more ornate the carving, the richer the fabrics, the more powerful the owner. So, who slept in this magnificent structure? The answer is often more people than you'd think. We have this modern image of the lord and lady of the castle tucked away in their private master bedroom. That image is mostly wrong. The main bedroom, or great chamber, was one of the most public rooms in the house. The lord and lady would certainly sleep in the great bed, but they were rarely alone. It was common for their young children to sleep in the bed with them. This was for both comfort and security. But the sharing didn't stop there. High-ranking guests would be honored by being offered a place to sleep. Sometimes this meant a separate bed was brought into the chamber, but for a truly honored guest, it might mean sharing the great bed with the host. This sounds shocking to us, but it was a sign of immense trust and respect. It was a political and social gesture. Even on a normal night, the chamber was not empty. Trusted servants slept in the same room as their masters. A lady-in-waiting or personal maid might sleep on a smaller, simpler bed in the corner. Or, more commonly, she might sleep on a truckle bed. This was a low bed on wheels or casters that was designed to be stored underneath the great bed during the day. At night, it was rolled out for the servant to sleep on. The male equivalent, a valet or manservant, would do the same for his lord. These servants were there for a reason. They were personal security. They were also there to attend to their master's needs during the night of. A drink of water, an extra blanket tending to the fire. They were a living, breathing alarm system and convenience service. The great bed wasn't just for sleeping either. Because it was the center of the most important room, it was where much of the family's life took place. A noblewoman might receive her morning visitors while still propped up against her pillows. A lord might conduct business, sign documents, or dictate letters from his bed. It was a place for socializing, for politics, and for family life. It was where babies were born, and it was where people died, surrounded by their family, household, and priests. The Great Chamber was a hub of activity. People were constantly coming and going. The idea that sleep or intimacy required total solitude was not part of their mindset. For the medieval elite, the bed was a symbol of their place in the world. It was a semi-public space where the most private and most public moments of life unfolded. It was a throne, a deathbed, an office, and a reception hall all in one. Sleeping in it, or even near it, was a statement about your relationship with the owner. It was less about personal comfort and more about social hierarchy. Between the peasant in his one-room hut and the lord in his great chamber, a new group of people was growing in the Middle Ages. These were the people of the towns and cities, the merchants, the master craftsmen, the skilled artisans. They were not nobility, but they were not poor peasants either. They formed a growing middle class, and their homes reflected their unique position in society. The home of a prosperous wool merchant or a master goldsmith in a city like London, Paris, or Florence was different from a country cottage. It was often a tall, narrow building squeezed into a crowded street. The ground floor was typically the workshop or shop, open to the public. This was where business was done. The living quarters were on the floors above. This very architecture created a new kind of separation. For the first time, for many people, work and home life were in different parts of the same building, not all jumbled together in one room. This was the beginning of a big change. As you went upstairs, you would find the main living area. This was often called the hall, a smaller version of the great hall in a castle. It was a multi-purpose room for eating and socializing. But unlike the peasant's hut, this was not the only room. Above or behind the hall, there might be another room, a chamber. This chamber, sometimes called a solar, was a step towards privacy. It was a more private space for the head of the household and his wife. And in this chamber, you would find a bed. It was probably a good bed, a sign of the family's success. It would be a sturdy wooden frame, perhaps with some carving and curtains. It might not be as grand or enormous as a nobleman's great bed, but it was a substantial piece of furniture. It would have a proper mattress, maybe stuffed with wool, and good linen sheets. Owning such a bed was a point of pride. The master of the house and his wife would sleep in this bed. But like the nobility, they often shared their room. Their youngest children would almost certainly sleep with them, either in the main bed or in a smaller cradle, or cot nearby. So what about everyone else in the household? A successful craftsman's household was often large. It included not just his immediate family, but also apprentices, journeymen, and domestic servants. Where did they sleep? They did not sleep in separate bedrooms. They usually slept together in another room, or sometimes in a loft or attic space. Apprentices and servants would share beds. It was perfectly normal for 2, 3, or even 4 young men to share a single large bed. Or they might sleep on simple pallets on the floor, much like peasants. The key difference here is the beginning of separation. The master and his wife had a private chamber. It wasn't completely private by our standards, but it was separate from the apprentices and servants. This created a new kind of household hierarchy. The family's core unit was starting to claim a space of its own. As a merchant or craftsman became wealthier, he might be able to afford a larger house with more rooms. This meant more separation was possible. The children might eventually move out of their parents' bed into a bed of their own, though they would still share it with their siblings. A particularly wealthy merchant might have a house with several chambers, allowing for a guest room or separate sleeping areas for male and female servants. This also meant that families started to own more than one bed. While a peasant family had none and a noble family had one great bed, a merchant family might own 2 or 3. The second best bed was a common item to be passed down in a will. It showed that the family had moved beyond mere subsistence. They had disposable income to spend on comfort and furniture. The beds themselves were also changing. While the curtained 4-poster remained the ideal, simpler, smaller beds became more common. These were just wooden frames, sometimes with a headboard that could be pushed against a wall. They were more functional than symbolic. Their purpose was simply to get the sleeper off the cold, drafty floor. In these townhouses, we can see the slow transition from the completely communal sleeping of the peasant to the semi-public sleeping of the noble. The urban middle class was carving out a new way of living. They valued family, but they also valued their status as masters of their own household. Having a separate chamber with a good bed was a way of showing that. It was still a world where sharing a bed was common. No one thought twice about sleeping next to a sibling, an apprentice, or a fellow servant. But the seed of a new idea was planted. The idea that a married couple should have a room of their own, a private space away from the rest of the household. This was a quiet revolution happening one house at a time in the bustling towns and cities of late medieval Europe. Life didn't just happen in peasant huts and noble castles. The medieval world was full of people living in other kinds of arrangements. Their sleeping habits were shaped by their unique circumstances. For monks, soldiers, travelers, and students, sleep was still communal, but it was organized in different ways and for different reasons. Let's look at a monastery. The life of a monk was supposed to be a rejection of worldly comforts. Their goal was a life of prayer and devotion, lived as a community. This philosophy was reflected in how they slept. Monks typically slept in a large, shared dormitory called a dorter. In the early Middle Ages, this was often just a huge open room. The monks would sleep on pallets or simple mattresses filled with straw, laid out in rows on the floor. Each monk had his own designated spot, but there were no walls or partitions between them. They were a brotherhood, and they slept as one. This was a deliberate choice. It discouraged private thoughts and possession. It reinforced the idea of the group over the individual. It also made it easy for the abbot to ensure everyone was present and behaving according to the monastic rule. Later in the period, some monasteries began to build small individual cells for their monks. But even these were not truly private rooms. They were often just cubicles with low, thin walls open at the top to the main roof of the dorter. A monk could not truly shut himself away, and the rule in many orders stated that a lamp must be kept burning in the dorter all night, a symbol of watchfulness and a practical way to maintain order. The life of a soldier was also communal, but for reasons of efficiency and control, not religious devotion. Soldiers in a castle garrison or on a campaign did not have private rooms. They slept where they could. In a barracks, this meant a large hall filled with rough beds or bunks, shared by many men. There was no privacy. Your life was lived in full view of your comrades. This built a certain kind of bond, a unit cohesion that was essential for a fighting force. When on the move, they slept on the ground, huddled together for warmth and security around the campfires. Perhaps the most interesting case for a modern person is that of the traveler. If you were journeying in the Middle Ages, you would need a place to stay. You would stop at an inn or a tavern, but you wouldn't book a room. You would pay for a place in a bed. Inns had a limited number of beds, and they tried to fit as many people into them as possible. It was completely normal to be assigned a bed that you would share with one or two or even three total strangers. Men and women were sometimes separated, but not always. You might find yourself sleeping next to a merchant, a pilgrim, and a traveling friar, none of whom you had ever met before. This was simply the economic reality of travel. Beds were valuable resources. Innkeepers maximized their profits by selling every available space in them. The travelers accepted this as the norm. Of course, it came with risks. You had to be wary of your bedfellows. Theft was a common concern, and many travelers learned to sleep with their money pouch tied securely to their body. There was also the unavoidable issue of lice, fleas, and other vermin, which were easily passed from one person to another in a shared bed. Universities were another place of communal living. Students at early universities like Oxford or Bologna lived in rented rooms or hostels. They too would share beds. A room might be rented by a group of 4 students, with 2 sleeping in each of the 2 beds. This was a way to save money. Life was lived in close quarters, with little to no personal space. Even pilgrims on a religious journey slept in large groups. Along the major pilgrimage routes, hospices were set up by religious orders to provide food and shelter. These hospices had large halls where pilgrims, rich and poor, sick and healthy, would all sleep together on the floor or on simple pallets. The shared hardship and the communal living were seen as part of the spiritual experience of the pilgrimage. What all these examples show is that the idea of sleep as a private, individual act was alien to the medieval mind. Whether you were a monk in a dorter, a soldier in a barracks, or a traveler in an inn, you expected to sleep in the company of others. Your status might determine whether you slept on a feather bed or on straw, but it rarely granted you the luxury of sleeping alone. For most people, in most situations, sleep was just one more activity that you did as part of a group. For hundreds of years, the story of sleep was a story of sharing. People shared rooms and they shared beds. It was a practical necessity driven by a lack of space, the need for warmth, and a social structure that valued the community over the individual. So when did things change? When did we start sleeping in separate beds? The shift was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping evolution that began in the late Middle Ages and took centuries to become the norm. It involved changes in architecture, wealth, and most importantly, ideas. One of the biggest practical changes was in how houses were designed. For most of the Middle Ages, houses were built with rooms that led directly into one another. And to get to the chamber at the back of the house, you had to walk through the hall in the middle. This layout makes privacy almost impossible. People are always walking through your space. A key architectural innovation that began to appear in the houses of the wealthy in the 15th and 16th centuries was the corridor. A hallway seems like a simple thing, but it was revolutionary. A corridor runs alongside rooms and allows you to enter each room through its own private door. Suddenly, you could get to your chamber without passing through anyone else's space, and they couldn't get to theirs by passing through yours. A room could now be a destination, not a passageway. This was the physical beginning of the private bedroom. At the same time, society was changing. The growing merchant class in the towns had more money to spend on their homes. As houses got bigger, it became possible to have more rooms for specific purposes. A family might have a kitchen separate from the main hall, they might have a parlor for receiving guests, and they might have more than one chamber for sleeping. With more rooms, the old reasons for huddling together started to fade. A house with multiple fireplaces meant you didn't need to rely solely on body heat for warmth. As families became wealthier, they could afford more beds. A son might get his own bed, though he might still share his room with a brother. It became a mark of status to be able to provide separate beds for your children. But the biggest change was happening inside people's heads. The Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation placed a new emphasis on the individual. Thinkers and writers began to explore ideas of selfhood, personal consciousness, and private life. People started to think of themselves not just as a member of a family or a village, but as a unique individual with a private inner world. This new focus on the individual led to a new desire for privacy. People started to feel a greater sense of modesty and a need for personal space. The idea of sharing a bed with a stranger at an inn started to seem less like a normal part of travel and more like an unpleasant or even dangerous ordeal. The wealthy began to demand private rooms when they traveled. The bed itself changed its role. In the nobleman's house, the great bed slowly moved from being a public stage in the great chamber to a private piece of furniture in a more secluded room called the bedchamber. This new room was seen as a space for the married couple alone. It was a retreat from the rest of the household, a place for intimacy and rest, not for conducting business or receiving guests. Servants still slept nearby, but they were more likely to be in an adjoining anteroom or in a room of their own in a different part of the house. This shift took a very long time. For centuries, these new habits of privacy were confined to the rich. The poor and the working classes continued to live in crowded conditions, with whole families sharing a single room well into the 19th century. The idea of a private bedroom for every child is a very recent development, really only becoming widespread in the prosperous Western world in the last 70 or 80 years. When we look back at the medieval world, it's easy to be struck by the lack of what we consider basic privacy. But they would be just as struck by our habits. They might see our separate rooms and private beds as lonely and isolating. They understood life as a fundamentally shared experience, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. Their sleeping arrangements were a perfect reflection of that worldview. The answer to whether medieval people slept in separate beds is, for the most part, a clear no. They slept together, and in doing so, they tell us a great deal about the world they lived in and the very different ways that humans can choose to live.